Hi everyone, my name is Amal Isa and I am Director of Programs at e-flux. Thank you for making it to e-flux tonight, and thank you for Rijin for making it to New York as well. And I am very happy to have you all here and to have Dina and Rijin. As you might know, this event was supposed to happen in March, but was rescheduled. And for a while yesterday, we thought that we might have to reschedule it as well. But yeah, luckily the air improved to only very unhealthy, so yay. Very optimistic, and yeah, here we are. Happy we are here on this earth and at e-flux. So tonight's program is co-presented with Arte East, and it is our fourth collaboration with Arte East, and the second in the context of their legacy project, Unpacking the ArteArchive, which preserves and presents 20 years of film and video programming of the organization. And tonight's program will be accompanied by an online screening on artearchive.org, which will start at midnight tonight and go on until June 18. And in addition to Sada Regroup, which we will watch tonight, and to a video of tonight's discussion, there will be a selection of documentary works created by students of the Baghdad-based Independent Film and Television College, which was co-founded in 2004 by Maysoon Pashashi and Qasim Abid. I'd like to thank Beth Stryker and Jinou Shwairi, who is here, and Arte East for their ongoing collaboration. Tonight's screening and discussion will revisit Sada, which means echo in Arabic. It was an online and in-person ad hoc art school set up in Baghdad between 2011 and 2015 to support artists working through the aftermath of the US-led invasion and occupation. We're going to start the evening, or rather, Rijin and Dina will start with a few words before the screening of Sada Regroup, which was commissioned by Documenta 15 in 2022, and which is 54 minutes long. The film was made nearly a decade after Sada and 2 decades after the invasion, whereby former artists of Sada came together again to reflect on their creative and disparate lives since that time. And it features videos by Sajjad Abbas, Bassem Al-Shakir, Ali Ayal, who is here tonight, and as part of a show at the gallery Brief Histories on Bowery, and Sada Munaf and Rijin Sahakian. Together, these videos comprise one experimental interconnected anthology film on individual and collective art practice in a protracted era of international warfare. After the screening, we'll have a discussion between Rijin and Dina again, which I'll hope you join as well. And now I'll briefly introduce our speakers. Rijin Sahakian has written and developed programs focused on Iraq as a site of prolific engagement. Her work responds to formations of American political, military, and cultural life through propaganda disseminated to enable global violence in Iraq and to diminish Iraq's long-standing experience of and resistance to these extraordinary conditions. Sahakian received an MA in Art and Politics from New York University, founding and directing Sada between 2010 and 15, soon after. And Dina Ramadan is continuing Associate Professor of Human Rights and Middle Eastern Studies at Bard College and faculty at the Center for Curatorial Studies. Both Dina and Rijin have also contributed writing and presentations to e-flux, and it's very exciting for us to have them together this time. Before I hand it over to Dina and Rijin, I'd like to thank Ali Hussein Al-Adawi, who had a part in co-curating this program. He couldn't be with us as he very recently moved back home to Alexandria, but he has sent a few words that I will read to you on his behalf. So Ali says, thank you so much all for coming and joining us today, and big thanks to Rijin, Dina, Arte East, and Amal for making this event happen. I have just notes from a jet-lagged mind about tonight's screening that I want to share with you. I am the child of a civil and social movement that initiated a public sphere in the form of demonstrations in Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2003 against the American invasion of Iraq, at a time when the contemporary art institutional scene was being founded in Cairo. The same Tahrir Square was where the Egyptian revolution would center in 2011 when Sada was initiated in Iraq. However, I couldn't fully grasp the implications of what happened in Iraq in 2003, nor fully comprehend the destructive legacies of the post-colonial dictatorships and authoritarian regimes of the Arab world until I experienced the consequences of the coup d'etat that crushed Egypt in 2013. The severe, bottomless collapse of infrastructures everywhere in every field is being supported and or initiated by the troops of US imperial democracy and the corporate states of the Arab Gulf. This collapse also forms the recurrent violent tension that incubates or haunts the films in Sada regroup. I have also much to say about another very important tension in these films between the traditional fine art education and persona and the one Sada was trying to propose at the time. There are no images of the genius individual, so-called autonomous artist commissioned by the state here, of the artist drinking ara in his studio or ranting about the loss of Mutanabbi Street. Instead, in the Sada films, we see reflections on and a rupture with this model. We see images of collective art learning and investigation edited with images of the difficult labor, whether working in art or other fields, of Sada artists to survive, to struggle for their artistic and general freedom in refuge and in exile, and to bear witness to this recurrent violence, scattering, and misrepresentation. So thank you again, and please welcome Rijin and Dina.
Thank you, Amal, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank Arte East and e-flux for hosting us, Ali Al-Adawi, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, but really was the momentum behind this event, and really thank Amal for helping us reschedule. This event was supposed to happen in March, I think as a sort of part of a moment to mark 20 years of the invasion of Iraq. And so I'm happy that we were able to make it back here today. And it was touch and go, but Rijin made it. So I think what we're going to do is just maybe start with a brief conversation to sort of set the context a little bit and get a little bit more of a sense for those of you who may be not familiar with Sada, of what this initiative was and what it was trying to do. So we'll talk briefly about that before watching the films, and then after the screening, we'll return to sort of discuss the films more specifically and this sort of regroup project that was part of Documenta 15 last summer. So thank you, Rijin, for being here. I was hoping we could start by maybe talking about why in 2010, 2011, you decided to set up this initiative, especially at a moment where I think, at least in the US context, Iraq was starting to fade out of sort of the media, out of public attention. I remember talking to Anthony Shadid a few months before his passing about how difficult it was for him to convince his editors, I think he was at the New York Times by then, to actually keep him there, that there was a story there. So I think this was a moment where Iraq was considered to be sort of over as a conflict for the US, as an invasion. So I'm wondering what the impetus, if you could tell us more about the impetus for that. I returned to your statement about the closing of Sada today as I was sort of thinking about the films. And I mean, there's so much in that statement. It's a really powerful, important text, I think, still to think about. But the closing paragraph was particularly striking to me, where you said Sada's intention was never to recreate an art scene or a market in Baghdad, nor to privilege nationalist endeavors which rely on the pretense of loyalty to artificial boundaries, armies, and the notion that histories belong solely to particular territories or peoples. History is, in fact, shared. So I was wondering if maybe you could give us a little bit of insight into the initial impetus.
Yeah, I think the Iraq War, the invasion, was in a way over before it even started for Americans, and in the American imagination, I suppose, or in the impact that it had in America. Or maybe the impact that people thought that it had, which was very minimal. In fact, the invasion of Iraq and the wars that followed it, I would say starting from 1991, has had a huge impact, continues to have a huge impact on how we live, how we fight, how we play. The Iraq wars were a kind of engine for research into technology and into urban warfare, which is the future, the present and the future, and was really a site for a lot of this kind of experimentation to take place. A lot of people don't realize that the first Gulf War was actually simulated as the first two-person game before it began, but simulated as a kind of war game, a supposedly imaginary war game 1 year before it was actually enacted in Iraq. And so this was the kind of multiplayer gaming that started World of Warcraft and the games that we see today, which are influenced by Iraq in more obvious ways, in terms of first-person shooter games, but also just the technology, the platform designed to have those games was really engineered by the funding to develop the war, the first war. And the second war, of course, involves robotics, involves, again, how some of the technologies that were already developed in Vietnam and in South America and in the United States, just in terms of community destruction and resource exploitation, but was, able to be reimagined in Iraq with the population there. Biometrics and all of the ways that we move through the world now were taken by actual citizens who had to give up their biometrics without permissions. So there are all kinds of ways that the Iraq wars have influenced the world that we live in. I would say that when the wars were actually happening, the amount of just sheer destruction that took place didn't really make a blip as far as I could see in American consciousness. And part of that was the development of an anti-war or anti-protest, how to counter that. That was also done through 91, but then also in 2003, where there were these huge movements to protest the war at the beginning, and then you didn't really see much of that as time went on, and with the election of Barack Obama. So I had actually conceived of starting something like Sada in 2008. I was working at an artist residency program in California in 2007. This was at a time when 1,000 Iraqis on average per day were being killed. This residency was in Silicon Valley, where a lot of the technologies used to kill were, being developed, and where there was just a very disparate sense of where we were in this sort of these beautiful hills, and what the results of that work was. And so I had curated a project called Iraq Reframe, which brought together a number of Iraqi artists, musicians, theater, performance. But of course, at the time, back then, and still today, it was impossible to bring artists from Iraq to participate. And actually, Anthony Shadid spoke as part of that series. And when he spoke about it, we had a series at Stanford where he spoke as part of the program. And what I remember the most about his talk is that he apologized. He apologized for being one of the journalists that was so taken by the kind of proximity they had through the war, that the military allowed, that he wasn't able to write with objectivity, you know, and that when he saw these tanks rolling into Baghdad was the first time he realized what he was a part of, the kind of machinery he was a part of. But anyhow, at that time, there were a lot of really incredible participants, and I don't say this to take away from their work, but I realized then that it was not enough to support work from Iraqi artists who were not living in Iraq at the time, because there was just, it just wasn't, it didn't make sense for me at the time to be supporting the work of people living in the States. And so I knew then that I wanted to start some kind of a project. I didn't know if it would be a project or what it would be. I just knew that I wanted to support artists who were making work there and to know what they were working on and what they were seeing, because it was, and I think remains and has been, like, really the center of world power, resources, this kind of extreme sight of what is possible. And so I actually, that was the reason I went and entered into the program at NYU, was basically so that I could have some kind of credential to fundraise for the project. I knew that was so that I could eventually go to Baghdad. And it was only by going there and meeting artists like Ali, who's here, you know, and speaking with them and understanding more of, is this something that is worthwhile? Is it something that might be interesting for, you know, I went to the College of Fine Arts and other places where I could meet and talk to artists and to see if this would be, if this would be something useful for them. And it was with them that we started to develop programming. Some of that programming was, you know, it was all kind of generated at that time, and all of it was online. You know, this is obviously a decade before COVID, but it was because the teaching artists or professors at that period weren't, you know, didn't feel comfortable coming to Iraq for obvious reasons, and there wasn't the possibility of taking students out of Iraq, which wasn't the point anyway. And so we did it all, you know, mostly online and through these kinds of informal workshops. So that was the impetus for it, I guess, even though there was just the sense that, and not just the sense, but the reality that the only way to understand a site like this is to be there. And if we think about art emerging from these kinds of cities or centers, whether it's like London or New York or wherever it might be, I don't think there can be a more important city in the world, you know, and it just seemed that that is where you could see the world as it really was, and only through the artists who were making work with that kind of experience. And so that was the impetus for it, and is where, you know, this work eventually obviously came from, but where all of it came from was really through their feedback and through their, like, incredible, their ability, their work and their experience.
Yeah, it's just thinking about, Ali Al-Adawi hinted at this also in his note, the fact that, you know, in 2003 we also see, with this sort of war on terror, right, this kind of emergence of a huge interest in arts and culture from the region, right, which, you know, continues for about another decade. And so I see Sada as being sort of kind of not a response to that, but actually just in sort of contrast to the kinds of art initiatives and exhibitions, the, you know, mega shows that we saw all over Western art capitals, the kind of work that, the humanizing work that arts institutions were doing, right, at the same time as bombings were happening. And, you know, you talk about this also in the statement, this sort of complicity between, you know, the military industrial complex and arts institutions and funding. So maybe can you say a little bit about navigating that sort of world, or, producing, curating artworks at that moment, kind of surrounded by all this noise?
Yeah. Well, the war on terror, and particularly the war in Iraq, was an enormous injection of capital into the region, and really, in that sense, enabled this, what we call the contemporary art market of the Middle East, to take shape. And so there's always this tension between the fact that there is this market because of the price of 1 million dead Iraqis, and more in Syria and Yemen and then elsewhere, and in Afghanistan, and other sites for the war on terror. So there was always this kind of sense that, and I felt it because I would go initially when I was first starting out, going to the Dubai Art Fair or to the Sharjah Biennale or to other places where at the same time that all of this violence is taking place and is being funded by these same states and in partnership with them, there's no discussion of the kind of shared responsibility of it or the funding of it. And at the same time, we're talking about things like representation and identity and objects. And there's no way to say it, but that it's a very ugly thing to know that there is this kind of creation of a world that rests on so much intense undoing. And I think there's like another word for violence that has to be used to describe what took place at the time. And so these tensions were something that, I don't necessarily exclude myself from. I'm sure that in some ways I was also, everyone has a role to play in that. And that was part of the issue with continuing, was that how do you continue with something where you are not part of the same violence that you're trying to somehow not be a part of, and to work with people that you care about and with the place that you care about and with work that you believe in for a certain reason and in a different way, but not take part in these systems that are really impossible to kind of stay out of, or very difficult to. So, this was all happening at the same time as these big exhibitions, fairs, collecting, and I think there's a lot to be learned from it because it's such an extreme case of a very specific set of wars, and you can really track it. You can track it with the first auction in 2006, in the Gulf with Sotheby's and then with Christie's, and so there's just a lot of overlapping. There's a lot of overlapping funding and circulation, and it becomes very impossible to get away from it. And part of the problem with part of saying that there isn't a kind of scene or a market that we want to develop or be a part of is that eventually you get pulled into that. There is a push to try to pull people into that and to create that. And on some level, you can't necessarily deny people entry into that either. It's also very unfair, and everyone has to be their own independent author of their career and the work that they do.
Do you maybe want to tell us a few things about the specific manifestation of the project before we maybe turn to the films? How this vision, this regroup took place, and the invitation for Documenta 15 and
so Documenta was in touch about a project. There had a focus on collectives for this iteration. And when I spoke to some of the other people who were involved and Sada artists who were involved, it seemed like I felt that it would be the best to do, or potentially the most effective way to work with the commission that we had and with the multiple members who were involved to do a video project, partially because we were all in different places at this point, partially because Documenta is a temporary event, and I thought that it might be useful to have a more permanent piece, something that could circulate after, and because, you know, Sada was also individual artists that were, you know, came together for certain workshops and for, you know, meetings together, but not necessarily doing a collective body of work. And so having the also ability for each individual to do something based around their own practice and experience seemed important. And because I think it's really difficult to envision or to understand what artists were going through during that period, and the kind of the way that the city and working as an artist within the city, what it meant. And I had always been asked questions about, you know, why Iraq and what's happening there, and these kinds of curiosities around it, which were difficult to hear. And also seemed very ignorant of the fact that there is so much information about Iraq if you just look for it and try to understand what is happening there. But I think also because there have been so many events that have taken place in such rapid succession, that it's also difficult to sort of sit and look back on the time, the period, even for me and for some of the other, you know, people who were involved. And so I thought that this might be a way for each of us to look back and to think about what that was during that time, and to have a kind of record of it that could be, you know, circulated in the future.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll go to the screening now, and then we can come back afterwards. Okay, maybe we can start actually at the end with your film as a sort of reflection on this whole process of bringing the group, or part of the group, back together in this kind of reflective piece after Sada ceased to be in 2015, and maybe you can start by talking about your work specifically as a reflection on that.
Yeah, well, part of the piece was also for each of us to be able to reflect on that time, and obviously we all had very different experiences, not all of which, you know, made it into the films. And, you know, not everyone that I asked to be part of the project also accepted. So I think there's obviously other stories that are missing in the project as well. And also because we were limited in not being able to invite everyone who participated in the films and the narratives that were, the experiences and narratives that were shown. With my film in particular, I think I was really just reflecting on what the reasons from Sada were, some of what I had learned from those experiences, but also just part of what I learned from it and what I learned from the artists who were involved in it, and looking back on that period, which continues in a lot of ways today. So I think while these films are looking back on a specific period of time, they're also, like any film or any work, made at a certain moment. But, you know, if we did this again, there would probably be a whole different way of looking at it, and a way of narrating, and a different piece that we would show. Sarah's family, for example, is now out of Ukraine, actually, and in Scotland. And there's, you know, different experiences that I think each artist has had, and also being part of Documenta and experiencing the films being seen in different contexts as well has changed. some of the experience of the film as well.
Yeah, and so many of the films, I mean, including your own, right? There's this sort of parallel reflection on each individual's like relationship to being an artist, or how that plays out against this also changing political backdrop that's constantly shaping their relationship to actually what it means to produce art in this context. Each one, I think, it goes through this shift, and both inside and outside Iraq, in terms of what it means to actually be trying to do that kind of production, that kind of labor. So yeah, can you take us through a little bit how that was part of the process or the conversation of selecting or deciding what people would bring to this collective piece?
Yeah, well, no one involved really had a background in film or video, so that was a challenge. And it was a very quick kind of learning curve. But I think part of it also spoke to the work we did in the past as well, where a lot of it was also learning together as we went, and figuring out new ways of working as we went along. And I think that was part of this process too. We didn't have a huge amount of time to make the films. There was probably a year and a few months all in all between knowing that the project would happen and actually completing the videos, the film work. So it felt like another way of coming together that was somewhat similar, but also, of course, very different, because we were all in different places, and it was a different kind of distance experiment, not because we were trying to do this project in Iraq, but actually because everyone was living in a different part of the world. And so it was a different kind of way of collaborating, and some people had been in touch, some hadn't. And so there was also a revisiting, I think, of Sada, of, people who are still obviously artists are still making work in Iraq and in Baghdad, and there's of course been an enormous national movement in Iraq that creative work has been a large part of, and that has been youth-led and countrywide. And so there are a lot of shifts also that took place in the country as well, that Sajjad speaks to in his film very specifically, and that I think shifted also some of the work that the story that he was telling, but I think also for everyone involved, it had an impact as well. So I think there is just always, as you see in Sarah and in the other films, there's always a kind of next shift or event that is happening, and movements that are taking place that shape each film as they went, and did so, I think, throughout the production period.
Yeah, and especially I think in the first film, with this kind of full circle that we make to the eyes that are watching, and the different responses that the artists have, right from the first moment, where there's sort of this fear and panic, and they take it down very quickly, to the closing scenes, and this kind of feeling that there's many more people surrounding them, right? That there's a whole sort of movement that is involved in that process.
Yeah, and I think what's incredible about Sajjad, that piece that Sajjad made, he made that piece in 2013. He was a teenager, when he made it, and the way his film takes place is because he's been filming for so long and has been taking footage for so long. And so when he made that piece, he was working alone and with some of his brothers and friends, they're artists in that piece as well, that he does it alone, and he takes it down because they're telling him he has to take it down. But it stayed up for a few days and had this huge impact, because what you don't necessarily see in the film explicitly is that the building faces part of the green zone. And in 2013, that was a big step to take, that you're facing all of these buildings and this like sort of source of power. And when he shows it at the end of the film during the protests that are taking place. You can see the sort of strategic importance that it had, but it's the same site that he worked with 10 years prior, prior to any of that happening. So I think it speaks to the fact that this work was a kind of like a public form of having this kind of agency and resistance to what was taking place, even on his own, with his own statement, but reflecting something that so many people were feeling that you then see when it manifests years later.
Yeah, one of the things I also found interesting as a thread between them all is this kind of essayistic quality in which there's a constant reflection on mobility and immobility. So many of the pieces are about sort of movement, right? But actually within the narrative, that movement's constantly being curtailed, right? So I'm thinking of Sada's piece where the car is constantly moving, but the narrative that accompanies it through these phone calls and these text messages is about sort of the limitations of movement. And then similarly, the way that Ali's piece reflects on kind of the limited movement of artists as well as artworks, right? So that kind of tension between, as you said, everybody is somewhere else, everybody's constantly having to relocate because of the changing political situation, but then there's this constant sort of feeling of being confined somehow.
Yeah, I think for many years, Iraq has been this place that is very much filmed, is a target in many ways, is a subject in all of these different capacities, but there is this, sort of lack of movement in terms of who has mobility and who doesn't. And I think in terms of the arts, and also what Ali's film points to is this kind of not just entrapment, but also the work that people are doing and the possibility and the kind of these sort of issues around circulation that aren't always discussed and that go much deeper than, getting a visa to go somewhere. It's not just about attending. It's so much farther away from just being able to attend an exhibition or for a work to be moved. And I think that's what is inside of that film. And, part of the issue when we do talk about the Middle East and contemporary art or art making or whatever it might be is that you only see the work that you're able to see. So if we're talking about a particular region, you only understand that there is work there, or that there is something of value there, in whichever way you assign it, if you're going there, in some ways. And for a very long time, what we've been seeing is no value assigned, or value assigned only through military or through corporate value in Iraq, because those are the entities that are sort of viewable to audiences and to people outside of it, and also to curators and to people who might be involved in the arts. So when I say that this question of who's making art in Iraq or what art are we seeing in Iraq, part of that relates to the fact that nobody is going there, and that's not to say that the answer is for curators to go there, which has its own set of issues, but that we have to recognize how much we don't see because people are shutting out. When I showed the editor of the art newspaper on that photograph of the map with the map up, the reason of showing that isn't just to say, show the hypocrisy of it, but is also to show that the geography of it. We're talking about huge areas with the majority of the Arab population living there, and tiny islands or tiny capitals that people are involved in. So there's also just a whole huge amount of the world that we're not looking at, and that we're just pointing to these really small capitals to look for some kind of identity or meaning or value or whatever it might be, and to think about what does that mean. And I think this is where this is where, when Sajjad has the piece and when people talk about mobility, we're also, I think, or I feel that with Iraq, we're also talking about zones of where we're able to look and value life, and that was used with the green zone, red zone rhetoric that emerged from the occupation. And the occupation of the green zone, which was in the middle of the city, visible to everyone, separated traffic, and was a visible reminder that there is an occupying force that is capable of doing whatever it wants, and a whole city around it that is supposedly subjected to that. And the resistance to that, is so important, because the entire world we know now, and is so clear now, is being separated into green zone and red zone. And now it's being talked about in terms of climate change. There will be red zones and green zones that people live in. So all of this has a kind of impact and a relevance for all kinds of populations and for all sorts of different meanings, whether it's this idea of climate change, which, you know, obviously is not necessarily about recycling, but about warfare, which is the biggest climate catastrophe in the world. And when you're talking about what places are livable and which will become unlivable. And right now, Iraq is on basically, you know, one of the top 4 countries that is going to be affected the most by climate change, or with the environmental damage that is being wrought. And that's not because of where it's located necessarily. It's because of the deforestation that's happened, desertification, all of these byproducts of the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, there was very early on the shot of Baghdad covered in an orange haze that we were just saying looked very similar to the pictures we've been seeing the last few days of New York, and of the kind of outrage, right, and kind of horror that people have been expressing over the last couple of days, in contrast to what has been going on there for decades now.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, the sandstorms have gotten worse and more extreme because of the lack of forest, green space that is able to act as a natural barrier. So there's aspects of the environment, and then there's, you know, where we're seeing the impact here with the smoke. And then there's all kinds of, you know, it's like the Trump, you know, and this idea that misinformation started with Trump, you know, or Fox News, without any any recognition that the most public misinformation, the one that had so much impact, was this idea of weapons of mass destruction, and the start of the first Gulf War and the invasion, with the testimony from the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, which also spurred this kind of fervor around the war in Iraq and acceptance of it.
Yeah, I was thinking about, in towards the end of your film, when you talk about the reason for working through video, or bringing these artists together and asking them to work through video, and the idea of flipping the screen, and Iraq, and both Gulf Wars being, but particularly the first Gulf War being like one of these places that, you know, one of the first wars to be sort of televised in this way, right? And then, you know, we were talking about this earlier, the ways in which, if we think about the exhibition on the Iraq Wars that happened at PS1 a few years ago, that was sort of very much like the thesis of the exhibition, right? But then there was such a focus on the images that came out by American artists, right? The way that American artists were focusing on these visual materials, and focusing on this 24-hour news cycle, right? And the way that that was kind of very productive for their sort of practices. And this seems to be in response to that, or a sort of pushback against some of the ways in which that has been the focus of the narrative of art and relationship between the US and the region in terms of artistic practice and artistic languages.
Yeah, well, the MoMA PS1 show on the Iraq Wars had several issues that, you know, impacted the exhibition itself. Some of the problems with artists who are making work about Iraq is that some of the way, you know, there were in some ways, it repeated the same, as you say, the same imagery of Iraq and the same narratives of the wars, of the American perspective on the war, propaganda around the wars, and didn't necessarily do anything to reconfigure that or to push back on it. Some did, but there's a lot of work that simply was in line with that kind of rhetoric. The PS1 show was instructive mainly in the ways that it showed as an institution that the war on terror and the Iraq wars were still very much in play within major American institutions and within the MoMA itself. When the exhibition took place, the head of the MoMA at the time, Leon Black, owned the company formerly known as Blackwater through his hedge fund firm and a number of other paramilitary and mercenary groups. And so when artists protested this, they were basically shut down from having any kind of protest around it. I will say Leon Black is no longer the head because of his $100 million given to Jeffrey Epstein and those kinds of connections. So that's actually what brought him down, not his ownership of mercenary groups in Iraq and Africa and a number of places elsewhere. But at the time, it was the issue was that though the MoMA prides itself, MoMA and PS1 prides itself on showcasing radical art and being a vehicle for protest within the museum, the protests were shut down. It was we were provided with misinformation about the nature and structure of the board. And when Ali Yas, one of the exhibitors in the exhibition, had a protest that was in partnership with members of the new museum, the MoMA PS1 brought in the NYPD to try and to come into the museum in response to the protest and characterize the protest as violent and threatening. So you have, again, a young Iraqi who doesn't even live in the States. He lives in Berlin, being criminalized for protesting a museum that has a war profiteer at the head during a time when this exhibition is taking place. And so I think if we were going to look at, so it's actually a very valuable exhibition in that sense, of looking at how the Iraq wars and Iraq protests or resistance to the narratives of the wars and the realities of them still are continuing to play out in partnership with police and state structures.
Should we maybe take some questions? I think should we pass around one of these mics, or do you guys?
So I'm wondering, thank you so much for the films and for the talk. I really appreciate it. I'm wondering, do you think that there's been any improvement in terms of the education, like the arts education system in Baghdad in the last few years since you've ended your project?
I think Ali maybe could speak to that better than me.
Hi. Nothing.
Thank you so much. This was so amazing to witness. How can Sada, or the work that has been done, how can that continue where it's not just an archive or a moment of this group coming together? How else can this work perpetuate, bring in others? Do you ever have those conversations or even that desire to do that, considering how all of these kind of catastrophic events have separated everyone from each other, from their families, and from their home.
Yeah, we talked about that quite a bit. If there was a possibility of reorganizing Sada in some other capacity or in a different way, the possibility is still open, I would say. I think the difficulty is in, I think, people who are still there and willing to take it on, because it's very difficult to do this without a very stable and consistent presence. And I think consistent funding is also very difficult. And there are a number of logistical and financial issues that evolve from it. But we've revisited it a number of times. And, some of the ways that the work continues is that several of the artists, Ali is here, and one of them, have continued to make really important work and continue to also, I think, give to artists who are still there and to circulate in different ways. And, more people are returning and work is still being made. And so I think there are still ways that there are opportunities to produce work and to produce together and to learn from one another. I think the question is how that happens, if it's in an organized form or not, or if it's in more informal ways. But there are still a lot of practical considerations, I think, in terms of having something set up there, although I think that is always, the sort of ideal, is to have something that is permanent and more stable and is a consistent space for people to come to and to be a part of. And I think also part of the wars in Iraq also should mean, I believe, that people open up to more support for artists that are working in Iraq, whether it's residency programs or MFA programs, fellowships, whatever that might be. And there hasn't been a sort of push towards that. And that is part of what's really missing, I think, in the American conversation as well, is part of a conversation about what is, and not just America, but, internationally, why that hasn't taken place, because I think it's very much necessary. And there is a loss of learning for everyone, I think, by not including the kinds of expertise that Iraqis have.
Thank you so much. It was very strong. My question, maybe since we watch the films and that's a project you done for document or videos, my question is related maybe to medium of moving image, and your film is really telling a lot about the power behind certain images that are accessing people, and the importance of producing other images. Also, what struck me, I think it was Ali Yal's film, when at some point the narrator says that about the going back to painting, and that the painting is the best medium for immigrant. So it actually made me think about generally within the group, within Sada, was it like a unanimous decision that this project is this medium you work is video and moving images, and how maybe you could tell a little more around the decision of making moving images and what does entail. I mean, your film to some extent already answers that, but in terms of like the entire program, I thought it's maybe, that's my question.
Like the reason we made films for Documenta, for that project? I think it was, partially what the films were saying, and partially because we were all in different places and we don't make work collectively necessarily. The project was open to everyone, but we there was not collectively authored work during the time. And so it didn't seem to make sense to do a kind of exhibition of objects or paintings or installations. Partially, that a lot of that was my decision, because I didn't think it would be fair to some of the artists who hadn't been able to continue with their creative work. And so it didn't seem like it would be, I didn't know that it didn't feel like a fair ask, especially in the time that we had with such a short period of time. And so the decision to do film and video work, or to ask if people would be open to doing that kind of work, was partially so that there could be a kind of, because video can give a kind of access, I think, to anyone, and all of us were kind of starting from scratch with that, except maybe Sajjad, who is more experienced as an editor. But having a new kind of medium to work in would allow, again, for circulation, for the work to circulate in a certain way and not necessarily have to be in other exhibition spaces, you know, in museums or galleries or that kind of thing solely. But with film could also travel back to Iraq in a different way and could be, you know, circulated informally and not necessarily, you know, with people having to travel to go and see something. And I think considering this question of mobility that infuses, you know, so much of everyone's experience, the mobility, I guess, of film too and video was really important and central to that.
But I feel also like Lucas's question was a bit about Sada itself, because Ali's film was mentioning that they were encouraged, or he was encouraged to work in video during the experience Sada, and then returning to painting at some point. So does this, like, what was the focus of video at the time? Is it similar to choosing to do the regroup over video, or what would you say about that, or like even Ali?
Ali should speak about that more. I didn't feel that there was a focus on video with Sada, but there were like writers who gave talks and different kinds of people who worked in different mediums. But I think Ali should. Oh, you have. Okay, great.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, the idea was like to make a video work about like where we are and where we are now at this moment, and I mean that was the theme, I think, and this is why I tried to do something with the video, like to change the story a bit, like when I said like we are apologizing to saying this piece because we fall in love with it, and yeah, that's like simply it was like, I mean the invitation was like to make a video piece, and I don't know if I'm close more with Sada. Sada. They don't have.
You know, I think that's what Dina's kind of clarifying. It wasn't that we were telling people to work in video during Sada's time, but the artists were coming from the Institute of Fine Arts and the College of Art, which focused almost exclusively on painting and sculpture. And so part of the workshops were also introducing new forms, you know, experimental forms or different forms that were possible, not necessarily that it had to be in those forms, but that there were many openings or entry points into making work that a lot of people hadn't been exposed to yet, because the art schools were still still in this era of teaching from previous generations that were focused on more traditional painting. Maybe Ali, if you want to speak a bit about the Institute of Fine Art and what was being taught at the time, just for the context. I don't know. I mean, I think, a more traditional kind of painting that didn't necessarily.
Then an academy and university, I think it's still like, and still going, and not only in Iraq. I think it's like everywhere. It's like academic training, like program. So Sada was like something else. We heard about it when we were like students in Institute of Fine Arts. We were like painters, but now, I'm still like following the ideas and things, and was a turning point to all of us. But for me and for other like friends who were in Sada, who were like doing like simply like paintings, landscapes, and I wish like to return to do something like with landscapes.
Yeah, and I would say it's not necessarily that painting was not viable, but that for some artists, not working in traditional painting with traditional subject matter was not supported by some of the instructors or by the school, and so being able to also work in a more personal or experimental way with painting also was something that was important for some of the artists there.
Hi, thank you so much for these videos. When I was watching them, especially the parts when you were talking about like these images of crises and obviously the US media eating them up and the art world's relationship to them, and which can be like parasitic and irresponsible. And when you were talking about the Gulf War show, I also couldn't stop thinking about the letter that you wrote as a statement for the Berlin Biennial. And I don't know if you want to talk about it or if it's just like horribly unpleasant to talk about. I'm just gauging from your face, but it just feels so relevant in a horrible way that you made this video and like articulated this mistrust of the art world. And then for that installation to pop up in the same country, it just feels like a horrible parallel conversation to each other. And I know that like some of the artists, the young Iraqi artists who were in that show, were shown like in relation to the big projected images of the torture center. And like I think like as you were expressing skepticism in this video, like I think in the letter you also said like I'm sorry to have even thought that I could trust these art world people with this recommendation. So like it's also like this horrible affirmation of like these things. And I know that you had signed the letter with people, and I was just wondering if some of those were the Sada artists, or if you could just talk about like how the conversations around that unfolding evolved, or like how maybe you penned a response to that.
Yeah, it's funny how that worked. I mean, it was not funny, of course. It was very horrible. We stopped in Berlin first because we were going to Documenta, and a number of people who were really instrumental, Ali Ayal, Omar Dewachi, and others who are here were incredibly important in the statement and in how things developed with that, with our withdrawal from the Berlin Biennale, and with what took place there. So we had made the films and were in Berlin first, which is where we discovered the blown up Abu Ghraib images. And it was sort of a testament to this kind of, sadly, that there wasn't a kind of a space where work can exist on its own, where Iraqi work, it felt, could exist on that kind of a platform. Documenta was, in a way, because we were there showing the films, and there was really minimal interference in the process of making the films for Documenta. In terms of the process for the Berlin Biennale, when we entered and saw the images, we immediately spoke to the curators to try to have to request that the work be moved. We had a series of meetings with the institution and with the curators who were involved in the show that were unsuccessful in terms of a movement of the work or any kind of sincere understanding of what the problems were with showing sexual assault and rape and torture, which we don't feel has any place as an authored artwork, and especially without consent of the victims. So it's torture victims not giving their consent for that work to be displayed, for their images to be displayed as part of an artwork, or for survivors of rape and sexual assault and torture to be photographed again as an authored artwork. So that was obviously a serious issue, not just for us, but for so many others who saw the images and understood what took place there. So if you read for those who read the statement and the response to it, that is part of what we experienced, was this sort of response that we were emotional and that we were angry, and that really we were just too close as Iraqis and as people who have a stake in what happens there and some kind of a relationship to the people who have been killed and tortured on display there, to be objective about the work that was shown and the way that it was shown. So the statement came after a series of negotiations that were unsuccessful, and we felt there wasn't really a possible response other than withdrawing from the Biennale. Part of that was because there wasn't this kind of movement that we had hoped for of the works and of an understanding by the institution itself, which showed itself to be a supremacist institution along with their curators. And partially because, and in no small part, because by having the work of our texts and the actual artwork itself being shown in such proximity to those images, it was a kind of tacit approval to the public that somehow they had the consent of the Iraqis in the show to the images that were being shown without our actual consent and the consent of the victims, which I should say some of whom are still alive and one of whom lives in Berlin. It doesn't matter either way where they live, but the fact is this is not something that can be done without, as I said, consent. So that was also the purpose for having a public letter, to also show that our consent wasn't given to these images being shown in this way, or to the way that it was characterized and sort of attempted to be explained away.
Rijin, thank you so much. I remember when I saw you the first time. I think it was 2012, 2013 in Beirut, and you had just come back from Iraq or something, and you had an observation. You said something to me that still echoes like a Sada till now in my ears. You said the level of humiliation that people have internalized is incredible, and no one is really trying to get at that deep internalization of this humiliation. And one of the difficult journeys with Iraq and working on Iraq and dealing with Iraq is trying to express that, but not necessarily in a form of mourning, but it's always a political kind of fight for many of us. And 20 years later now, we are still fighting, and we're still dealing with this open wound that we're not unable even to heal, and it does not even becoming a scar. So you just mentioned the kind of the emotional level of this. I'm curious, where do you think how do we move from here? I mean, art is always a way for us to kind of, deal with with history, with this openness, and it's very tough always to keep on fighting, you know. And I'm curious, when do we get you know, time to mourn? I don't know if it's a question. It's maybe just like an opening in ways. But I'm you know, I just thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thank you. I think that is some of what's reflected in the films from the other artists, actually, is making that space. And actually, that was a big part of what was in Laith Karim's film at the Berlin Biennale, which was also part of what was, is that he, in his film, was creating a space for mourning. You know, in his film, he has friends, neighbors, family members, all centered, taking turns entering this old car and talking about the experience of being in cars during the time when there are so many cars exploding and bombings happening, the kind of spontaneous everyday violence that people were living with. And so that project that he did was really incredible because it held this sort of space for the people involved in mourning and reflecting and sort of working through what it meant to be in the car during that time and what it means to see so much unraveling in front of you. And he had children who took a turn in the car to talk about what they had experienced, older people, his peers, colleagues. Ali, I think you're in the film. And it's a really beautiful piece. And I think that is also this question of when do we get to mourn? Because that was Laith's contribution also at the Berlin Biennale and what was taken away from him in the Biennale with the act of the images that were presented with it. And I should add that Sajjad's eye that was in his film was the other piece that was intersected in with the Abu Ghraib images of rape and torture, and of Iraqis piled up with American dogs at their feet. You know, so this is also where these moments that people are working through a kind of resistance and making that space was taken away, but it was also regained because they acted and removed their work and stood up for their work. And we all collectively said no to that kind of violence that was being perpetrated by the Biennale. And so there was some sense of at least being able to move through that, and for the work no longer to be there was very important by the end of it, and to be able to write together and to say that this is not something that is going to be accepted. And unfortunately, I think also speaking to the violence in Iraq, we were the ones who had to say it because the work was reviewed. It was seen by thousands of people in Berlin, and no one else said it. But at least the artists were able to do that. And so I think it's that kind of recognition and resistance of the artists of Iraq itself with these historic, enormous protests that have happened, and in so many, many ways that are too many ways to count that take place in Iraq constantly.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. My question has more to do with the filmmaking practice, but I'll start by asking, you mentioned there's a short timeline for the production of this film. How short was it?
So short. It was probably, I don't know, it was a month for actual production. It was about maybe 6 months that we knew had confirmation that the project was going to happen, and that there would be funding, and then getting in touch with everyone and all of this sort of pre-production sort of thing. But the actual production was about 30 days for each of us.
Well, I just asked because I know that filmmaking is a very hopeful and disappointing process. When you guys first took on the project, was there a kind of collective hope for what the film would contribute or how it would be disseminated? And has that changed after you guys have finished it and you've had a screening? Maybe I'm asking you too soon, like to analyze something that you've already just reanalyzed, but because you say it gives you a lot of agency coming together as a collective, specifically in the scenario, and it definitely shows just the fact that there are artists sitting here with us, more than one. So if you could speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think, because the process was so fast, I think, honestly, I don't know, my hope at least was that we would actually finish them, that they would happen, for myself too, included. And so it was a very rushed, it was a fast process, an intense process, but a positive one, I think, overall. Ali can speak to this too. I think being at Documented together was really incredible. And Sarah wasn't able to, Sarah's the one of us who didn't have her visa to go. It wasn't accepted to go. She's living in Turkey. So she was missing from the experience of seeing the project unfold. But I think for us actually being in the space, we were all there for at least a week, and being able to see visitors watch the films and to be there together for the first time in so many years was really incredible, and was a moment that I wasn't sure that would ever happen. And since then, the films have circulated, some individually, artists showing their films specifically, sometimes together. And so I think that has been really, and that was also the purpose of it too, not necessarily that it would always be shown together. And so I think that has been, I think overall the hope that we had for the films to show was, was really just having them show at Documenta at least, and for us to be able to be involved in that experience. Ali's film did show. Did it show at Brief Histories this past couple months?
The cabinet, though, no?
Yeah, it's only shows in the solo show and in Ottawa, my first solo show. And tonight I have opening in Berlin. I'm gonna show, a video. Yeah, just tonight. I don't know if it's yesterday or tomorrow.
So you can see it at, oh, can you? Or Ali's is also showing work at Brief Histories here in New York, right?
Now I have a show, and feel free to come. Yeah, I have a show, a group show on Brief Histories. Yeah, not video, it's painting. Yeah.
I have one question. There is a sense in the film of, usually when we do revisiting or regroup, there is always this temptation to do, where are they now? What are they doing now? And there is this kind of temporal, I don't know, like, I don't know what to call it, like, not, like, almost complicity with each other, but also like some kind of temporal ambiguity there concerning where everybody exactly is, or at which time, or what they are doing with their lives now. And yeah, I'm just curious a little bit how this came about, because it's almost universal to all of the films in the film. Like there is a bit of an abstracted sense, even with the part with Sarah being in Ukraine. It still feels a little bit like, it's dislocated, it's hopping from one place to another, from one year to another, from one context to the other. And it seems like this kind of very non-linear, which is understandable, but also like there's this, I don't know, Yeah.
Well, when we talked about it, the sort of prompt, I guess, was very loosely sort of this idea of reflection of that period, and sort of where people wanted to take it from that. And there was no sense that we couldn't be specific. Maybe it's that there's so much change, you know, for each person, and it might just be that seeming like there's a kind of finite place where someone is not part of the reality.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. It is sort of, Ali speaks to that with the fragmented pieces, what Dina was saying of each artist.
Yeah, and Ali seems to be like really nowhere, maybe except in some dream space. Like we don't know what this field he is in, or what this room is. It has almost no characteristics beyond his story or dream, or yeah.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the experience of each of the artists who were involved, and how much transition has happened. And with Sarah, those were her parents who were in the car, who sent her that video on their cell phone. So she was in Turkey when that happened. But that's still, yeah, I think that is just that kind of space. I don't know if Ali, you want to speak to that a little bit, this lack of sort of finite location where people are, where you are in the film.
Yeah. Or even you sometimes, Rijin.
I don't know. I'm feeling a bit shy to share anybody. I mean, I don't know, like to talk about the video or what. Like, shall I change? What's the question again?
How there isn't a specific location that you can't identify where people are in the film where they've ended up, but that there's so much kind of movement and fragmentation.
And you mean in the
In your piece, right? We don't know where that room is.
well, yeah, it's a bit hard. I didn't prepare for that. I feel like I'm an audience here. I left Ali somewhere else. I mean, yeah, for me, when I decided to make this piece, I started with like a piece, like a short text, and then I tried to translate it to make it more close to me, like intimate piece. Like I started with the wardrobe, the most intimate piece, like in any Iraqi house. And I just tried in this video work to talk about Sada. This is a small letter inside the wardrobe, hidden between the clothes of my family, or let's say my relatives, and yeah, and yes, I just spoke about my time with Sada and Baghdad, and as like someone talking about me as like a medium or assistant of that Ali that got lost as those fragments inside the wardrobe. And yeah, I just like created this as usual, like short story. Like I found the pieces, and like it's easily to see. The artworks are like everywhere, but it's hard like for the artist like to travel with their pieces. But thankfully I'm here. Like I can come and see you, but I'm still carrying like few documents like with my backpack, like my Iraqi passport, because it's valid and I could travel to any states and my green cards files, like if I got caught by somebody like, or like a crazy officer in the airport, so I can show him my, the papers that I printed, like many papers, and so it's still ongoing. I don't know. So and now the video traveling, thankfully, different cities, but I'm here. I don't know if that's enough, but I'm I'm a bit bad to talk about my project, bit shy.
No, I think you said it. I think the sense that it's still continuing and that people are still not. I mean, also part of what Omar is saying about having a space for mourning kind of means that something is over or finished, and now people have time to do that. And I don't think that has happened yet for any of us or for anyone who's involved. And so it does continue in all of these different ways and is still being carried.
Any last questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Rijin. Thank you, Ali. So just to follow on that thought, I was curious if the idea of taking these particular works and arts in places that are not just Berlin and New York, but elsewhere in the world that maybe Iraqis have more ability to be in, and just what is the possibilities of connecting with artists in Turkey, in places where Yemenis have gone, and other diasporas that have experienced similar pain and creation based on that, and if there's a way to connect with those kind of communities, specifically thinking about elsewhere where since 2011 there's been a lot of hijra and expulsion, so beyond these Western capitals, might there be a way to connect artistic movements elsewhere in the world, and especially, as you point out wisely, right, like this kind of fixation on where the art market is going, is there a possibility to connect with Latin America or cultural production elsewhere?
Yeah. I think there has been some connection, and Ali Issa, thank you. Ali Issa did the really wonderful translation for the subtitles for the films. There has been, there's so many artists, and I think they're all over the world, and so I think there are a lot of collaborations happening that I don't necessarily know about, or know of a few different people working in different places, but there's so many artists doing different work. We are showing our films in Brazil in the fall. A video Brazil, and some of our work has been translated in Brazil previously, which has been really actually productive because of Brazil's own history and its parallels, or there's a relationship with Iraq's. And so that has been a really productive relationship that we have had, maybe more personally. But, there's actually a long history of Iraqis going to Yemen and vice versa, and work that has happened for generations, So I think there are also some natural, not necessarily, whatever we want to call contemporary art things happening in those places, but I think there is a lot of artwork happening, or artists going between, Syria or Yemen, different parts of the world, not necessarily that we don't necessarily highlight, or maybe we're not specifically involved in. Sarah speaks about her time in Turkey, and Turkey has had many exhibitions of Iraqi artists exhibiting in Turkey, and obviously there's a big relationship with Turkey and migration with Iraqis as well. I think it's just a question of how people end up knowing certain people and exhibiting work or sharing work, but there are so many informal ways that people are working together, which is which is helpful. And I think, in particular with Yemen, that history and the more recent history that has, a lot of resonance with Iraq as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rijin and Dina. Thank you all for coming.